All right, so I'm joined by my nephew, Tyler, who is a master's student at Edinburgh, and he's studying science, philosophy, and religion. And we're going to discuss the idea of subjective idealism, or specifically the question, are we a thought in the mind of God? Or another way to phrase it is, how do we get from the one to the many? So to start off with, Tyler, I was thinking, could you give us kind of a background of what you are studying and specifically how it ties into this question that we have for today?
Um, well, I'm not necessarily studying this question. I guess I'm studying different ideas about God in general. This one hasn't come up in school. It's just been something we've been talking about. But since I
You've
go
been
in
leaning
Catholicism,
towards this idea called panentheism, right?
kind of like that's the clearest term for it, it seems like, but it's not used that much in Catholicism or other forms of Christianity because it has some broader connotations and background problems. But I guess it seems to make it makes sense because it's a middle ground between two other extreme positions, pantheism and what's the other one? I forgot.
Well, for pantheism, can you give us the difference between pantheism and panentheism? What's the main
Yeah,
difference?
pantheism is the idea that God and the universe are one, and panentheism is the idea that the universe exists inside of God, but God also exists outside the universe.
Okay. All right. So that kind of gets us to our question. If the universe exists inside of God, then are we a thought in the mind of God? So this is the question that we're trying to tackle. And the issue is that, well, we see that there are different things in the world. There's different entities, different people, but is the underlying reality, is underneath all of this a oneness, a kind of unitariness, or a kind of separateness? Is ultimate reality peopled by a multitude of different consciousnesses or just one unitary consciousness?
So I guess starting off that I think that that framing might have a problem because when we're talking about fundamental reality, do we mean original? Like what's the first thing to ever exist? Or are we talking about what things are irreducible?
Okay, well, I guess one way to think about it is if we if we are a thought and mind of God, if we exist inside the totality that is God, then does that mean we are ontologically real, or are we some kind of character in a dream? It is where the question is about our ontological status. If we are as fundamental as whatever exists fundamentally, do we exist as separate individuals, or are we part of a larger whole that consumes us? For example, upon death, do we fall back into this undifferentiated oneness? Or to quote, I believe she's not in the Catholic Church, but she's some other kind of tradition. I think it's the Anglican Church, but she wrote a book called Love is Stronger Than Death, and her idea is that that we could survive the fierce particularity of love, that the soul would not be subsumed back into the whole, but retain its identity. So the question is, if we are a thought in the mind of God, do we still retain our separateness, our individuality, or are we fundamentally subsumed by the whole?
Well, the first thing I want to address is the the idea of ontological status, because that what the metaphor we're thinking of is going to be different if we're applying it to God. So when we think of a dream character, we think of something that exists for a moment and then doesn't exist, and it doesn't have any material substance. But if we're applying this to God, then we do have a material substance, and we seem to exist for a while, and we are aware that we exist. So like, what would it mean for one of our dream characters to be aware that they exist? Like, I guess that would kind of mean like, okay, they pop into existence and then pop out of existence when we wake up. And I guess that gets to the other thing you brought up, which is, do we get subsumed back into the whole? That answer seems to me to be exactly the same as saying we just stop existing. You don't need a idea of an afterlife because the consequence would be the same, to say that I exist now, and then later I'm going to return to something else.
Well,
Yeah, it's the same as saying I exist now, and in a few years I'm going to be a bunch of atoms floating around. It's the same answer.
well, there is a famous poet who talked about the river being afraid of going to the ocean, and he said it's not that you should be afraid of disappearing. It's not about disappearing into the ocean. It's about becoming the ocean. So the idea is that your consciousness enlarges as you enter the wholeness, and then you realize that you are that whole. I have issues, obviously, with that particular point of view because, I mean, I have an issue with the idea of a oneness to begin with. And I guess that's where my motivations are coming from, that I want there to be variance in reality. I don't want everything to be one substance. I want there to be relationship. And you cannot have relationship if you're just one thing. You can't have like a relationship with yourself. And that's where my motivation is coming from. And therefore, um, this is usually at odds with different types of idealism, including panentheism, because it's very hard for a panentheist to say that there is something other than the oneness that is everything. So
Well, that's why I wanted to clarify, what do we mean by fundamental reality? Because I would agree with you that there are actually different things in existence. And whether or not we call that a dream, I don't think matters so much, because we can get into this later, but there's reason to say that God exists in everything and like causes everything to exist, and everything also exists in his mind because he conceives of it. So it can be both ways. But what I wanted to clarify initially is because I wouldn't say our existence is fundamental in the sense that it's necessary or first, original. But
okay, so you're
agree that
separating the concepts between what comes first and what can be reduced to something else. So are you saying that we might not come first, but we are also irreducible? We cannot be reduced to something else.
Yeah. So like, yes, we do exist irreducibly, and even though I'll argue later that God is I think it's efficient and final cause of us, we still, and because we don't exist fundamentally in the sense that I think you're going to argue for, I'd still say we are irreducible.
Okay, so like the example of like a parent and a child. So the child did not come first. It didn't create itself. The parent created it, or the parents created the child. But the child cannot be reduced to the parents after it's born. You can't reduce the child back to its parents. So would that mean that we are, so the Catholics have this view, at least someone in the Catholic Church had this view, that the idea of a photocopy, so God photocopies himself, we are photocopies of the original. Or I don't know if they use the word photocopies. I believe it was an idea in the Catholic Church a while ago, but the idea of a copy of the original. And that the further down you go, the copy gets less and less accurate, or less and less like the original. And the closer you get to the original copy, the more like the original it is. So do you think whatever it is we are, do you think that is the same substance, the same essence of the thing that created us?
Um, I'm, I don't know about essence. Like, so there's terminology that I'm still getting used to. I'm reading mostly Aquinas at the moment. He talks about essence and energy and form and matter and stuff like that. But I think if you're asking like, are we made out of the same substance, essence as God? Uh, yes, but not in the sense that like we're made out of matter, therefore we are just exactly like all the other bits of matter in the universe. Like we are still a unique thing um, in materialism or theism. But that argument you mentioned does sound a bit like Aquinas's idea of why there are differences in things. He basically says God can't create something identical to him because then there would be two gods and one of them created the other, which would make them unidentical. So either they're different things or there's only one thing. And the different things are going to be different in certain degrees. Some of them are going to have more closeness to the original. So I don't know if it's like a photocopy that gets blurrier over time because that, I don't, you know, it's not like well, I suppose you could bring in other arguments like sin, corruption, um, entropy, and like the decay of matter and stuff like that. But if we're just talking about pure creation, it doesn't seem like there's no need for the photocopy to be imperfect. I think the photocopy maybe it's not a photocopy; it's just paintings. God painting different pictures. They're all different in some way, but they're all from him.
I guess I guess like if you have a concept of a painter and their painting versus the concept of uh, parents and children. So parents and a child is the same essence, the same substance as the parent. They might not be the same in capability. Obviously, like a child or a baby is not as capable as the adult, but they're the same essence, right? But if you use the metaphor of a painter and a painting, that creates a huge divide between this essence of the painter and the painting, right? They're not definitely not the same essence. They're definitely not the same substance either. Uh, and so if you have the view that reality is, or what we are, or reality is a painting of an external painter, that's kind of similar to the idea of a thought in the mind of God or a character in a dream. But if you have an idea that ultimate reality is like a parent and their child, a parent and their child, um, right? You get a very different kind of relationship between those two things. It's a
Not
relationship
necessarily.
of same substance or same essence.
It's closer, but you know there's the metaphor of the artist's creations are their children as well, and if in a sense like we're made of matter, the things we create are made of matter. We have a form, and we are able to think thoughts and imagine forms, and then we impose forms on matter as we create things in that sense. Like you can say that it's similar but in different degree. So maybe in that sense, maybe we're sculptures, whereas a tree is a painting. But the metaphor of child also works, and that's been the more common one for humans. But I don't know if we would necessarily say a rock is God's child in the same way.
Yeah, I guess there's two things we have to account for. One is multiple consciousnesses, like human beings, at least, if not some kind of animals. Then we also have to account for some kind of matter or physical world. There definitely does seem to be a difference between human beings and a rock. like as far as which one is most fundamental. If you have an idealist perspective, which I suppose everybody who is Christian or at least any religious of any sort must have some kind of idealist perspective. In that case, we have to account for why there is a physical world and how that differs from people or human beings or consciousness. But the main reason we're asking that question is because we want to know what the relationship between human beings is to ultimate reality. Secondarily, as a secondary point, we want to know what the relationship between human beings and nature is. But how do you think we could go from a unitary substance to a plurality? Because however you think of whatever metaphor you use, there has to be some kind of space from which the oneness can create into. But if everything is one, it's created in itself and out of itself.
Yeah, the Christian idea, though, is that creation came from nothing, which does seem to be an impossible idea. But I'd be interested to contrast it with your view first, though. So could you explain that?
All right, well, see, I say it's my view, but it's actually, I think there's a lot of overlap between different Christian mystics or different ideas that have been around in quantum physics or in other places. And it's the idea of fundamental reality not being able to be explained by, or only explainable by substances, but also by other things like relationships. So the relation between the relata, though it's related, is as fundamental as what is related. So if you have A and B, the relationship together is as fundamental as the substances. And in some views, it's actually the relationships themselves that are more fundamental. So I don't take that view. I take the view that relation and substance or property are equally fundamental. So the properties and the relations are equally fundamental. And therefore, we get a reality that is not singular, it's not unitary, but it's also not separate, it's not pluralistic, but it's a kind of reality that's interconnected. And this interconnectedness is very similar to the concept of the Trinity. So a concept of a Trinity is, I mean, there's different ways to explain a Trinity, but one way is that you have two things relating to each other. So like a relationship. And the relation between the two things is a third entity, if we use the word entities. And together, that this Trinity creates a third thing. It's not a one person, it's not a two people, it's a third thing that's not one and it's not two.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, I think this is the kind of structure of reality. And therefore, from this structure, it can create things like itself. And what it creates is like itself. And that means that we, being created, are like the thing that created us. Now, it's a little bit technical to say how this thing can create. So the idea is if everything is one, right? I guess you can say you can create in your imagination, like a dream. But if the whole universe is me, right, then I can't create anything new. It's just inside me. Everything's inside me. But if reality is two, a self and the other, right? The other provides the space, the superpositional space for the self to create into. So the self breathes into the other, breathes creation into the other receives the creation into itself. And it's kind of a cycle going back and forth, because from my position, I'm the self, and your position, you're the other. As my position, you're the other, I'm the self, but your position is reversed. You're the self and I'm the other. I can create because you give me the space to create, and you can create because I give you the space to create. And I think reality, I think that's fundamental reality, and that reflects in everyday reality, whereas we are the creation that is able to create.
So I have two questions. First, you're contrasting the idea of creating, the self creating in the space of the other with the self creating within the self. Aren't both instances, though, not necessarily creation but change? And if we want to say change is creation, then we could also say that change within the self, like if there's a monad, if only one thing exists and it changes itself somehow, that could just be just as much creation as self changing the space of the other.
Yeah, I guess it depends what word we use for this creation concept. So the word I would prefer is something like procreation, because that makes it more clear what we're talking about. So monad, let's say everything is one monad, a oneness, and that thing can change itself. Like let's say it's always in process of becoming. It's always bubbling up with potentiality, right, within itself. But it can never be what it is not. It can never be anything but itself. So everything is itself. It cannot procreate. Because in order to procreate, you need some kind of space that is not you. If I want to birth something into the world, there has to be a world for me to birth into, right? I can't birth within myself. I mean, I could, but that would be quite different from the concept of procreation.
So I agree that it would be different, but I don't see the difference with this idea that you're creating inside the other. Because I guess, is the distinction just that, is it just like ownership? Like if I change, so probably the best analogy is materialist worldview, where the only thing that exists is particles. So particles can be rearranged, and that's what materialists, even us, call things, distinct objects and unique objects. But they're all within this oneness that is just particle soup. So the difference with your view is that there are two particle soups, and one of them creates distinct objects in the other. Is that correct? But
Well, okay.
that's exactly the same if there's just one, right?
Well, one way to think about it is the idea of, when you think about a being, like an entity, right? If an entity creates within itself, that is self-evolution. That's you can evolve, you can change, right? Yourself. But you're always doing it to yourself. In order for the being to create another being, there must be something outside of itself, right? There must be a space outside of itself for the other being who is not itself. If the other thing is itself, right? The law of non-contradiction, which I find some fault with, but the idea is, if the other thing is me, if this thing I created is me, right, then there is no other. There's only me. There's only self, which means true reality is a oneness. If you want to return back to the source, that is true reality. If you want to keep living in an illusion, you can keep living in this world where you think you're separate. But if you die, you return back to the source, which is you identify with everything. You are everything because you are God. Because there's no difference between you or God, because you are God, right? So that's why I find it very problematic for, I mean, I guess this kind of view is very complicated anyways. But traditionally, for most Catholics or most Christians, they would not equate the person with God, right? They would say, okay, we're not, right? But then if we follow panentheism, which is basically the only option we have, then we must say that whatever we are identical to that thing because we are in that thing. I mean,
Right.
we,
That's the reason I was at the beginning. I mentioned that there's problems with panentheism that I've come to realize, even though does seem like the best term to explain this idea.
yeah, so
But
that's the main problem. If the oneness is creating within itself, then we are identical to the oneness, which is what a lot of people think. I mean, a lot of people have that view. Like everything is energy and you return to the source, this kind of stuff. But I don't find that view compelling because I don't want to be one thing, right? I want there to be different things. I want there to be different people, and I want there to be a relationship of people, not a oneness of everything. And therefore, that leads me to the idea, which I find in the concept of the Trinity. I find the seeds of this idea that there can be a third option, right? We don't have to be one substance. We don't have to be separate random individuals cycling this world, but we can be something else. We can be this other entity, which is a Trinitarian entity. But you have some other issues with it?
well, I like the idea of the Trinity, obviously, but when when we apply it to humans, who we are assuming are not God, then it becomes problematic, I think, because I still don't understand how, like, are you saying that the self creates the other, or that the self creates in the space of the other?
Well, okay, so there's two pieces to it. The one piece is that the self, when we have the self and the other in a relationship, in order for the self to create, it creates into the space of the other. And the other, because from the other's perspective, they are the self, and etc. So they create into the other. But the question of where did the self and the other come from? Well, that's the same. It's the idea of causa sui, so self cause. How the self is created is because of the other, but the other is created because of the self. So they both come into existence because of the other. It's kind of like the chicken and the egg. The egg doesn't come first, the chicken doesn't come first, but they both kind of enter reality into the same time. Or another way to say that is they're always existing.
But there is a difference between changing the other, or creating something in the space that the other provides outside of yourself, and creating that space, creating that other out of nothing. Um, so if like we're talking about two consciousnesses, let's say, then we have them talking to each other, and consciousness A changes the mind of consciousness B. In that sense, they've created a new thought that's not theirs. So you could say, like, yeah, they created something new outside of themselves, but that still relied on the existence of this other consciousness, that other space. And from that consciousess's perspective, it didn't create something outside of itself, it created something inside of itself, which is just change. And so we get back to the problem of saying, well, why not just say there's one thing that changes its own internal properties? If we're saying that consciousness A creates consciousness B, then we get back to creation ex nihilo, which is the Christian view, which I would going to defend. I'll just bring up my view quickly to the two contrasted. I agree that the Trinity is fundamental, but not that humans are a part of it, because humans are contingent objects created out of nothing. And the problem of where's the space for this creation to happen, I agree that it's a problem, and I don't know that there's a solution, but I think that the best solution is just to line up all the different possible views, see which ones make the least sense. And it seems like creation out of nothing is the one that makes the most sense, even though it doesn't actually make sense.
Well, I mean, it's possible to merge our views. So if you think that there's a Trinity, but we're not part of the Trinity, do you think that the Trinity can create? And if
Yes.
so, can we be So if the Trinity creates, we assume the Trinity creates okay, I'll say the word procreate. So do you think the Trinity can procreate?
Well, like within itself or
Well,
outside of itself?
I mean, I guess we're using the word procreate to mean make a make a new thing that has the same substance of itself. All right, I guess just
Yeah,
like the regular term of procreation, but
yeah.
can it have children? I guess.
But into what space is the problem? Because I
Well,
would agree that it can have children, but like typically children exist outside of the parents. They're in a sense they're not created out of nothing, but they do become independent, and there's a space, there's a material
that's true. There's
world.
already a world there for the parents to birth their child into. Um, but if a trinity, so remember, a trinity is not, it's a different concept. So it's not like a like normal logical reality. So if a trinity can have babies, can have children, then the children will be in a trinitarian relationship with the trinity. So the baby itself will be in a triune with the trinity as a kind of like infinite replicating triads.
But
Um,
the difference with the first Trinity is that you said it exists, it always exists, it necessarily exists, whereas the second one wouldn't. But in order
here's the
to
other
explain,
problem. The other problem is we exist now. So therefore, we must have always existed, at least in potentiality. So when we're talking about these kind of fundamental levels of reality, the difference between actuality and potentiality get very blurred. So if
not
we
necessarily.
exist, is what?
Well, no, because like anything we can imagine can exist potentially, but that doesn't mean it does. So
Well,
there's
I
a
mean,
special distinction
can
between.
anything we imagine exist in potential? I'm not so sure. I mean, I guess like if you take the acorn and the oak tree, in that example, we can say that the oak tree exists in potential, but we can't say a squirrel exists in the potential of the acorn because there's no squirrel in the acorn, right? But so it's possible that if we are the tree of the acorn, then we have always existed in potential because the acorn existed. I mean, that's kind of a tricky concept, but I mean, it
So
seems like
not,
it's
not
inescapable.
pure potentiality. Like
It's
you're
what?
not saying not pure potentiality. You're not saying like this Trinity can create anything. Like based on the evidence that these certain things exist, they must have had the possibility, potential to before. Um, so what? I guess that would prove the potential of the things that do exist. But would it limit it to those things? Would it? Because there's a difference between something like just because something could have existed and then did doesn't mean it was necessarily always going to exist or that it needed to. The potential could have never been fulfilled or could have been fulfilled a different way. So how do we get from this potential was fulfilled to, I guess, what you're trying to say?
All right. So the idea is that there are some things or there's an infinite amount of things that are in potential, but only certain things come into existence, become actual. And since we are in existence, since we exist, does that make us contingent things? Does that make us like we could have not have existed? Or are we necessary things that we were necessarily going to exist? We're always going to exist. My view is that if we exist, we must have always been existing, at least in potentiality. And one way to think about that is if you think of time as not being fundamental, and if you step outside of time, um, then then can we think of things in the same linear way as a time when you weren't existing and then a time when you are existing? Or is everything happening all at once in a sense? And that if at any point you ever were going to exist, then you would be existing. already. I guess another way to say that is, how does the idea of creation work if we take out the idea of time?
Yeah.
Or is time just part of God's nature? It's fundamental.
So time is caused by change. And it seems like in order for there to be changes, there has to be causes of changes. And so we would still get the creation as a cause of something. Requires time, I guess, or maybe time comes into existence when something is created.
Hmm.
But the idea that we must we necessarily exist because we do now, that I guess that argument does away with the idea of potentiality altogether. Because if we say that the thing, like, well, we think of potentiality into the future. We say there are all these things that could happen in the future. Some of them are going to happen, some of them aren't. But if we're looking backward and we're saying this thing did happen in the future, and from that we say it was always going to necessarily, then that does away with the idea of potential for things to potentially happen or not happen.
I guess it depends
There's
how you're
such
using the
thing.
idea of potential. So if you're using the idea of potential as the acorn and the oak tree, then the idea that the oak tree was always there in potential, I think that fits. But if you use potentiality as like superpositional states, like everything, fundamentally everything exists in superposition until it chooses a path, which path to take, then you might get into problems with what about all the paths that didn't get taken? What about all the babies that weren't born, or that, that kind of stuff? Now, I think if you hold the traditional view of potentiality in the oak tree example, you can still have potentiality, and whatever happened was always happening, was always part of the beginning. Whatever happens in the end was there in the beginning.
Yeah, potentiality just as growth. But the you still have the problem of what caused the growth, what initiated, and this is the reason God is said to not have any potentiality within him. He is pure act because he is the cause of everything else, and every potential thing needs a cause in order to be actualized. So there can't be any potential in God, otherwise nothing would ever be
Hmm.
actualized, including himself.
Yeah, but
So
if there is no potential, then there could also not be anything.
I agree. If there's no potential, um, there is nothing. I guess, and if there's no,
So it can't all be potential, and it can't all be act. It has to be both, right? I suppose.
in order for us to like know that there exists something, I guess we would have to either exist necessarily or have been caused by something that exists necessarily.
Hmm. All right. Well, back to this idea of, are we a thought in the mind of God? Um, is there any other way you can explain it to keep the tenets of panentheism, but also keep the idea that the individual doesn't subsume back into the whole?
So yeah, there's the idea that God exists in everything as its cause, as the source of existence, pure act. He keeps things aren't that don't have the power to exist on their own to create themselves, keeps those things in existence. In that sense, he is present in everything, and everything participates in God.
Okay.
And then there's also the sense that things are in a mind if the mind is thinking of them. So my thoughts are in my mind, and the images I can create in my mind exist within me. So in that sense, everything exists within God as well. I guess the question is, can these different ways of existing in God and God existing in things allow for things to exist at all, or we're just saying everything is God?
Yeah, allow for things to exist fundamentally. I
So
suppose.
fundamentally, you mean indivisibly?
Yeah. So like, I mean, we can say your dream characters exist in a way, but they're definitely not fundamental. They're not going to like pack their bags and walk off. Um, but at the
Well,
same time,
we aren't fundamental either in that sense.
well, fundamental in the sense, so if you're talking about causes, so when you use these terms, efficient causes and ultimate causes and these kind of things, it becomes a little bit problematic when what it is that what we're trying to figure out is this idea of the mind. So idea of causes complicate the question. If the question is there one mind or is there more than one mind? If we are in the one mind, do we exist independently in some sort of sense? Do we have an independent existence, or are we a piece of that mind? So like what we mentioned before about Kastrop's disassociated alters, that reality is one mind or a God, and we are all disassociated pieces of his identity or whatever her identity. So if we are a thought in the mind of God, it seems to me that there's a couple of conclusions that are a couple of implications. One is that either his mind is fragmented into our different personalities, and then once we realize that this is an illusion, our separateness is an illusion, we reach enlightenment and we return back into the oneness, which is everything, and we become one God again, one whole God. Another implication is, okay, maybe we're not split personalities of God, right? Maybe we're just kind of like characters in a dream, like semi-real, semi-autonomous entities, dream characters, for instance. But both of those I don't like either of those. So what other way can we describe reality that keeps the concept of individuals, but also doesn't reject an idea of an ultimate creator or essence?
Well, we're certainly more like dream characters than we are like God. Like the problem with the first answer that we've been fragmented from our source and then we're going to return to it. The problem with that is that either I don't exist now or nothing else exists ever. Like I don't know what it means to say the mind has been fragmented. If I exist now and I return to the source, then either I stop existing, I guess, um, at the source, or the source becomes me, in which case everything else stops existing.
But will you become the source? You just,
Yeah, everything else does. Well, because so it doesn't make any sense to talk about that sort of I guess like return to fundamental reality, because like you might as well just say, okay, either I am God and I'm the only thing that exists, or I don't exist. And
well, see,
and that,
it wouldn't
yeah.
be, you wouldn't say that you are God, right? Because what you call you is a tiny piece. It's a tiny fraction of a whole that you are unaware of. And then once you realize your separateness is an illusion, you get reconnected back to the whole. This view is not like, it sounds weird, but there are many mystics or even the Catholic Church or other Christians who espouse something like this. The words they use kind of makes it sound like it. And I think the problem is because we haven't agreed upon this fundamental question. And therefore, you have some poets or mystics who say something like returning to the source. Then you have others who say something like the woman I mentioned who talks about surviving the fierce particularity of love. You have these different competing ideas, and I don't think it has been settled yet, even among religious traditions, especially in Christianity, of what
Yeah,
exactly the
right.
relationship is.
But if we say we're disassociated, where we disassociate? What's the gap between me and my
Well,
old self?
I think one example. I don't know if that guy brings up this example, but there is an example of people with split brain syndrome, where
Yeah.
their right and left hemispheres get cut for some accident or some other thing, and it seems like they display two distinct personalities that don't seem to be aware of each other. Um,
Mhm.
I have some explanations for this, but uh, if you take if you take it on face value and say it looks like there's two personalities who are now disconnected because their brain connection was severed, um, then we can work back from there and say, well, imagine we reconnected the brain hemispheres, and each side would remerge back into each other to become one. So that's one way of looking at the concept of disassociated alters, as much as I dislike that concept. But it's been a concept that's been around for a while. And what, how would we, reject it? On what grounds do we reject it if we are all inside of God? Or if, like the other alternative of the dream characters, the dream, so that alternative is that whatever this, I guess it's kind of like an Eastern kind of concept where what we call self is an illusion. So actually we don't really exist. We're just like it's like one of those computer game characters that gets a little bit conscious and it's like, oh no, I'm real, I'm alive. Well, actually not really real. They're just, an NPC character. Um, that's also problematic.
Yeah. I don't think that makes any sense. What would it mean for a video game character to get like slightly conscious but not really exist? Like if they're slightly conscious, then they're just slightly conscious and they exist. Like if they
Well,
don't exist, then there's nothing to fool. There's nothing to trick into thinking it exists.
well, like if you have a dream and let's say you there's a person or somebody in your dream and they seem to have a kind of like inner world to them, like they seem to be a person. Um, what is fueling them with that existence? I mean, well, I suppose if you take the unconscious psychoanalysis point of view and say, okay, those people in your dreams are imbued with the power of your subconscious or your unconscious. They're taking on traits of your unconscious. Um, and I mean, it might even be possible a kind of disassociation happening because when you dream, part of you is, well, let's say if you have a regular dream where you're a person walking around in some place, right? So you're the person walking around, but you are also the building that you're walking around in, right? So somehow in your mind you disassociate yourself from the building. So let's just say the dream is you are walking around in the building. Um, Somehow you created that building. So that building is part of you, part of your mind, and somehow you created the person who's walking around. But the person who's walking around is just a limited version of you because it's not you are that thing, but you are also the whole construction that your mind made. That's one way to think of. That's a
Well,
more pleasant way to think of disassociation.
you're not just the environment your mind made. The dream is a small part of who you actually are. So I think
Well, that
I
too.
like this metaphor. I don't think it's perfect, but I don't think any metaphor is going to be perfect in this case. So I would say we are in that sense, a dream character in the mind of God. But that doesn't mean the dream character doesn't actually exist. Like if God is an entity that makes things exist, and then he dreams up this thing called us, and then he wants it to be, have a identity and agency and to do things, then that seems like just by pure will, he makes us exist. Um, so I don't see the problem with saying that the dream character exists. Like actually, it doesn't exist fundamentally in the sense that it doesn't cause its own existence, or it doesn't cause God's existence, but it does still exist.
All right, well, if this God is all powerful and he can will, like Pinocchio, he can will the wooden boy to become real. We still have the question of in what space or out, like, I guess another way to put it is if we think of consciousness as a focal point, like a, a, a pinpoint of experience looking outward into something. If I have this one pinpoint, one focal point of awareness, and you have another one, and yours is not mine and mine is not yours, are we both, is what we call God a collection of all our focal points? So all our focal points exist in God. Or
Two different statements.
Is what?
Those are two different statements. Saying it is God the collection of all our focal points is different from saying all our focal points exist within God.
Well, I mean, we could say God is more than just our focal points. It could be other things, but I mean, in general, it'll be the same as like if God is these different focal points. I mean, I don't suppose that there's anything else in existence besides focal points. Like if you're an idealist, you say consciousness is the only thing that exists, right? Or not the only thing that exists, but the only thing that exists fundamentally. So if
are you an idealist, though?
It's what?
Are you an idealist?
Well, see, so my view is a kind of relationalism. And I guess fundamentally it's a kind of idealism. But with the self, remember the self creates into the other. So the other provides a kind of objectivity for the self. So the problem with idealism is that it can't escape subjectivity. The problem with materialism is that it's only objectivity. There's no subjectivity. So I would merge those two together to give objectivity and subjectivity. And how that would work is that me being subjective, right? I have the other to provide objectivity to me. So the other becomes objective to me, and I become objective to the other. So therefore, we have a reality that can be subjective and objective at the same time. And that's how we escape. Like what?
I like that idea.
Oh, because we're getting some getting closer to our different views.
But is that different from the metaphor that we exist as a dream, as God's dream?
Well, see, we still have this problem with the dream metaphor, because using a dream metaphor, everything in the dream is kind of fractioned of the self. It's kind of fractions of the self. And therefore, either we have to say we're disassociated identities of the one whole identity, or we say we are secondary I
images.
guess, yeah, like images of this. So if we have a dream, I don't suppose if you meet someone in your dream, I don't suppose they're also having an experience, you know? I don't suppose they have like an inner dialogue in their head looking at my dream, looking at me. Look, we're looking at each other. I mean, it's possible that there, it's possible that we have different entities walking around our dream. I'm talking about not if you dreamed of something, supernatural, but if you have a normal dream and there's three of you interacting with each other, I don't suppose the other two are also thinking things while they're interacting with you.
Yeah, it's not a perfect metaphor, and that's why there's the metaphor of child and son, or parent and child, father and son. That's more common, but the distinction, I guess, it seems like there needs to be a balance between the two, because we're not saying that we are like we're not gifted the ability to create ourselves the way God as our parent doesn't give us that power to be literally be God. The way parents, I guess, give their kids the power to be full-grown adults and to create their own children. So in that sense, we are more on the level of a dream to the God who is more real, and more powerful. But then, yeah, we do have the problem of saying, okay, our dream characters don't have their own souls, their own agencies, their own identities.
I like your idea of merging the two, because I much prefer, obviously, the idea of parents and children. But the idea of a parent and child makes the child of the same essence as the parent. And I guess, why would you be against that?
Well, it's just not
Observable, like it's not.
well, so yes, observable, but also it doesn't, like, even if take observation out, it doesn't make logical sense to say that we are like a baby god and then we'll grow up into a full god. And then we'll create our own humans who will then grow into their own gods. Like, even I think Mormonism kind of has something like that, where humans can reach sainthood and then they become like mini gods. But even then, there's a higher god, and this is the problem with all polytheistic religions. There's always a higher god that created the lesser god. So that's the problem with saying that we are ontologically the same as our creator, and using the parent analogy doesn't quite work the same way. Dream analogy doesn't quite work.
Yeah, I guess they both have some issues, although it is, in Christian terms at least, it's much more common to see the parent and child or father and children.
Yeah.
And then later on, and this is what I think is interesting between Judaism and Christianity, is that in Judaism, it's a lot of father and son relationship between God and man. And in the New Testament, you get a lot of husband and wife relationship between God and man, which seems to indicate an even more symmetrical relationship. Now, I guess it does. Would there be a problem if the ultimate created something that would be equal to itself?
Yeah.
Like created a partner for itself, kind of like a
Yeah.
bridegroom.
So Aquinas brought that up.
Yeah.
I mentioned it before. Like, if God created God with the same power as him, then they would be identical. And two identical things is really just one thing.
Oh, okay. Yeah, but remember, if it's a trinity, and a trinity creating a trinity, and if it's in a triune relationship, then you could have two equal beings that don't cancel each other out.
But we'd still say those beings are one. So the Trinity is three persons in one being.
Well, I mean, it's one, but it's a non-logical one. It's a two things connected by a third piece that become one way I try to describe it is like a pair of shoes. So a pair of shoes has a left foot and a right foot, and the relationship, right? You need the relationship. You can't just have two random shoes. You need the two matching ones. So it's a relationship and the two shoes that matter, but together they make one thing, this new thing that didn't exist before, called a pair of shoes. And I think that, I mean, it's obviously a bad metaphor, but I mean, it's like as close as I can get to try to describe what I mean when I say the word Trinity. And therefore, this, if you're in this triune relationship, you kind of can be, oh, maybe that's what it is, like a right and left shoe. It's like they reflect each other, and therefore they can be identical and not cancel each other out because they reflect. Oh, that's what it is, reflecting. They're reflecting each other. So they're like mirrors that reflect each other, and therefore they don't cancel each other out.
Well, there's a reason the idea of the Trinity didn't originate until recently, whereas the idea of single God has existed for as long as humans have. The questions we use God to answer do not reveal that there's a Trinity. And it is a non-logical thing. I mean, there's been reasons given for it after it was revealed. But Aquinas has a section of the Summa that I didn't understand any of it, but he starts off saying, we can't understand the Trinity through logic, but I'm gonna do my best to see how far I can don't understand any of it. But if even he's saying we don't understand it, and so if we're going to use the idea of God to explain stuff like our existence and the universe's existence, then it kind of defeats the purpose if we say, yeah, but we're a copy of God. We're exactly the same. Well, we don't need God then. We don't need, if we're just if we're one of the shoes that exists fundamentally, we don't need to posit the other shoe. We could just say we're not a pair. We're a single shoe that exists.
Well, I guess the issue with that metaphor is because what I'm trying to describe as fundamental reality is a pair. Without each of those shoes, the pair doesn't exist, and therefore reality doesn't exist. So I'm not talking about reality at the level of the individual shoes. I'm saying that fundamental reality is this thing called pair. And this pair.
That's because you want other people to exist, right?
Yeah.
Like I'm guessing so because I'm guessing you weren't thinking like you had this idea that God exists and then you need to figure out how we exist with him. I think you started off saying other people exist. How does that work? Right.
Well, I mean, kind of like both, because I guess like even if there was no one else in the world, right? It just one person, and the person was thinking about the concept of God. The person will want to know in what way are they related to God. If they are the same thing as God, right? The kind of a Buddhist concept. If they're the same thing as God, then they need to just open their mind and realize that they're identical to the godness that is everything. But that doesn't sound the most pleasant to me. The most pleasant would sound like that there is a relationship of everything.
Mm-hmm.
And
so why an equal relationship?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it would seem like if you could choose a type of relationship, it seems the more equal relationships or the more symmetrical relationships are preferable.
Not if you're considering, not if you got to that question by contemplating God, it would seem like it would defeat the purpose of the contemplation to value an equal relationship. Like it would be more like taboo.
I guess the equal relationship is more, it comes from the opposite way around. It's more like, I prefer not to be everything. Therefore, I'm okay being partnered with everything. So it's more like you start off with everything is one, And then you're like, okay, I don't want everything to be one that's too much for one person to handle, which is the idea of God disassociating himself because he can't handle existence. So I prefer not to be everything. Therefore, the most I can accept is equal relationship. Like most I can accept, meaning that I don't want to be everything, but I'll be okay. The most I can do is being in symmetrical relationship with everything. Of course, there's a third option of being like a child to an adult, which is even less responsibility. So that might go over even better.
We're not doing so great with the responsibility we already have. I don't want to ask for more.
Well, I mean, the amount of responsibility you would have if you were everything, if you were God, is just sounds quite infinite,
Yeah.
and quite unbearable. So I suppose, but then there's also something if you think about like
The same amount
child.
of responsibility you would have the same amount if you're equal. So there's the idea of reflective now. That maybe two things can be equal, but like facing different directions. But I don't know. I need to think more about that. But it seems like just before you had that analogy, if we just say two things are equal, then they're one thing.
Well, you said it's equal responsibility, but there's this. I mean, there's a lot of quotes about how you know how can we bear the weight of the world, the weight of the human condition, and the response to that is, well, because we're not bearing it alone, because you can bear it with somebody else, and that's
If
kind of the idea of.
they're bearing something else, like if so, use the analogy of marriage. You say that's more of the type of relationship you want with reality, but there are differences in marriage. Like that's the whole point. Like the reason there's a distinction between marriage and friendship is because there are specific differences in sex and in roles. Um,
But there is a it's not
you
the
say it's
same it's not the same level of responsibility if only you existed in the world. Like imagine there's a world and there's you. You're the only person in the whole universe. The weight of existence, the loneliness, right? But imagine there was you and one other person. Suddenly that weight is on both of your shoulders and therefore more manageable. So I guess that's more
well,
like,
I don't see any weight if you're so I don't think God has responsibility. I think we have responsibility because
I guess
there's
not
one.
really, maybe responsibility is the wrong word, but it's more like the immensity, maybe might be the right word.
No, because you would be the most immense thing.
Yeah,
You
but
God.
it might be uncomfortable to be the most immense thing.
I don't think it can like the problem with the Buddhist analogy is like we're taking our position and we're applying it to God. It's one of the reasons that you don't like it and I don't like it, doesn't feel right, is because we just are smaller than reality. Like if we want to say, yeah, but we are reality, and that would make us feel bad. That's only because we're imagining from our current small position.
That's true.
If we
We could do just be
feel
imagining
bad,
from our
we would
small,
just
limited
there would
view.
be no, there would be nothing to feel bad about. We would like everything that existed would be us. There, the only reason people feel bad is because there are things outside of them that they can't control or that they want differently. And so, yeah, there's a lot of this, there's all these different conceptions of God. God is pure act, is pure goodness, the moral laws, the pure existence, all these different things that aren't mappable onto our own uh, our own individualities. So that's why I'm not a fan of saying that we are equal in an equal relationship.
All right. Well, we've made some connection across the aisle between what we are as far as maybe some kind of balance between a father or a parent-child relationship and a dream character relationship. But I guess it will take a longer time to figure out the next step, which is, are we equal to or in some way in an asymmetrical relationship with this oneness. And I think we got like 30 seconds left on this recording, so maybe we can wrap it up there. Thanks so much, Tyler. It was wonderful talking with you, and have a nice day there.
You too. Or good night.
Thanks.